Yeah, with respect to the last talk, we spend a lot of time in Florida where we're worried about sea level and talking to the public about this. And one of the things that emerges is that comments get made, including the one that you made a moment ago, saying that 1.5 degrees warmer and we can do away with all of our tropical coral reefs. Now, I'm immediately responded by the public who knows about the coral reefs which formed Florida in the Eocene, which was between 9 and 14 degrees warmer than it is today. And so the question becomes whether or not that comment is consistent with the historical record, right? If we lose 1.5 degrees and all our coral reefs are gone, but between 9 and 14 degrees warmer in the Eocene, we have Florida is made out of coral reefs. It seems to me that it tends to undermine the credibility of the other parts of the argument, which should be taken much more seriously.
Shall I respond immediately? Yeah, thank you. It's all a question of speed, of course. I mean, coral reefs, you can have cold water coral reefs, you can have them in Baja California, which are very temperature tolerant, and so on. You can do it. But I mean, you just need a sailing boat and go out to the Whitsunday Islands in the Great Barrier Reef and just explore what you see there. And you find that even during the last big El Nino event, so 2 years ago, 40% of the reef were bleaching actually. And we can recover if there is an intermediate time of 10 to 20 years, but we can assume the next El Nino is in the making, but the frequency is so high of these warm water events that they cannot recover anymore. So, of course, if we can wait for, say, 10 million years, we will be fine, clearly, and there will be a completely new biosphere, self-organizing, and will deal wonderfully with 500 or 600 or even 1,000 ppm, as we had it 600 million years ago, or 300 million years ago. But for our lifetime, actually, for the lifetime of human civilization, we will lose all this natural capital. I mean, wherever you look, ocean acidification, glacial melting, and so on, the speed, the rate of change inflicted by human interference is about 100 times the natural rate. So 2 orders of magnitude. If the Floridians can deal with that, wonderful.
Any further questions? Lord Rees.
Yes. You showed the cartoon about the alarm clocks. Would you like to say a bit about how we can be more effective? I mean, politicians themselves will only respond if there's strong public pressure. So can we have further analogues of what the papal encyclical did, which you think may help to push these things higher up the agenda?
Thanks, Martin, for the question. Of course, this is the million or billion-dollar question. I think on the one hand, it's a mixture of things. I think referring to imminent disaster makes sense, because you have to warn people if the house is burning, you have to sound an alarm. On the other hand, I think it's innovation, discovery, and in the end, it's a moral choice we have to make. I mean, several people referred to that, Steve and Bill and so on, the yet unborn, the poor people who do not even know what is going on. Most people in Africa have not even the slightest chance to understand what is going on Earth, in the atmosphere, whatever. So that's the one thing. The other thing is, what we also discussed here 2 years ago is, I think you need, in the end, I'm pretty convinced now, given German policy making, I think you have to have a really good story to tell, a positive story. Yeah? You have to tell a story where everybody would like to be part of it. So on the one hand, you would say, yes, the planet is going down the drain if you keep on, flying and everything. But that is not enough. You have to tell people, oh, here's a vision of the future, something you would love to be part of. The good story, I think, is in the end tipping the scale.
Any other questions, maybe for Dr. Clark?
Yeah, one question that just occurred to me regarding your presentation. Among the list of capitals, you had the capital of space in terms of geography. You had the capital of language, so to speak, in terms of knowledge. What about the capital of time? Would that be a capital on your list? And I think it relates to what you were saying about social capital declining, and if I connect to your presentation about the moral choices and this Schellenhuber's law, I think there is a crucial aspect of time in how we balance threats and attention periods.
That's the second hardest question in the theory of sustainability today, is what we do with time. On the one hand, I think most of us, whether coming out of the welfare economics tradition or the dynamical earth systems tradition, have a hard time thinking of time as a state variable the same way we would think about people and knowledge and land. So it doesn't come in that way. It certainly comes in calculating whether we have time enough to adapt to changes, how long an investment in new technologies would take to actually penetrate the market space enough to work out. So time is not absent from this, but as a thing you hand on to the next generation, that's been problematical. On the other hand, the most well-developed part of this theory, which is about the optimal depletion rates for finite resources, for coal, oil, iron reserves, and so on, which has really been worked through quite carefully. There, time absolutely does enter the way you say it. If you're Saudi Arabia sitting on top of fossil fuels, at least absent major legislation against fossil fuels, then simply by waiting 10 years, as other people's demands become higher and the supply becomes smaller, means the value of that asset goes up. And that would be the same for sitting on chromium assets or other exhaustible but not yet exhausted resources. And right now, those two don't fit. We can do the theory one way or the other way, but not in a way that nicely integrates the two. I can't resist, so I'm going to do the question back to you. The biggest theory problem is what we do about the absolute size of population. Because if our computation is focused on the well-being of people, now and in the future, and obviously we're worrying about the quality of life, the way Professor Lutz discussed, and so on. There's one way of looking at this, of saying a world that equilibrates with, say, 8 billion people, 9 billion people, one of your lower trajectory ones, as against one with 16 billion people, we have only half the people well-being. Again, providing we can not deplete resources and that everybody's getting the same size pie. But we have strong arguments that say, well, actually not. The quality of life for the 8 billion person planet is going to be a lot higher on average than the quality of lives for people on a 16 billion person planet. And the analytics community is stuck with this notion of, are we valuing the total mass of humanity having good lives, or are we valuing the average life of a person, but not particularly concerned about how many there are? And that we look to, among others, philosophers and people out of religious philosophy on how we should think about that. So do I want more people, or do I want fewer people with higher average quality of life?
Yeah, maybe since I saved 2 minutes in my talk, I can take the liberty to also make a comment. Now, first of all, I even think this is the most important of all our resources, even more important when to come to grips now with the world population and so on, because again, this needs time. I think Wolfgang Lutz's scheme is a wonderful one and will work in time, of course. So what politicians, also to refer to Martin Rees' question, what politicians lack is a sense of irreversibility. Yeah? So that things happen in a non-linear way, but you go across a threshold and you cannot simply go back. They think the world is more or less a static place where you can shift forth and back and correct and calibrate a little bit. They are not aware of the fact we are making every day hard choices, actually, and some of them cannot be reverted, actually. You cannot unring a bell. I think that is the right expression in this context. You can't unring a bell.
Do we have other questions? Lord Rees?
Well, just to come back, that I think the most widely accepted route, which would be helpful, would be to accelerate research and development into all forms of clean energy and other parts of infrastructure of the kind that Steve Chu mentioned, because R&D in those areas is very low compared to, say, medicine and defense. And if we could enhance it, that would be win-win, because it would be good for the countries which develop the technology, and also it would allow India to benefit from the cost reduction that would follow and leapfrog directly to some kind of clean energy, and also provide an inspirational goal for all young engineers to provide clean energy for the world. And this is something which does not demand anyone to consent to anything which may look like a short-term sacrifice. So I strongly feel that it's important for nations to push for this expanded R&D.
I'm always impressed by the consensus among the scientists. We all know what's at stake. We all talk to each other. We are in a bubble. And we have the instruments and the proposals of how to produce a change. But apparently change can be induced only if the public at large exerts enough pressure on the politicians. And there's one way in which this pressure is exerted, and this is, for example, with the refugee problem, that people just start to migrate and make things very uncomfortable for those who are in power. But we should perhaps think about other ways before misery really puts enough pressure on the politicians to get more public. And I wonder how we can take on this responsibility as scientists. Which are the mechanisms that we have at our hands in order to reach the public at large? Should we get into the social media? Should we have lobbies that work on the press? What can we do rather than sitting among each other in academies where we all are consensual? We have to have more outreach, otherwise it won't change. It will only change once the catastrophe has occurred, and then it's too late.
Maybe the question is for me, but Bill, of course, could also comment on it. We are sitting on two different sides of the Atlantic, so my response is more or less Eurocentric here. But if you would have asked me the same question last year, I would have been much more negative about it. We feel, at least in Germany right now, that the mood is shifting. There is change in the air, in the sense, give you an example. I mean, we had a number of elections, regional elections, but now today, even in the nationwide polls, you see that the Green Party, and the Green Party, I do not agree with everything they say, but they are, of course, for environmental protection. They are for being open to refugees, for example. They are for closing the gap between the poor and the rich and so on. That's a progressive agenda. And it turns out, and this is very important now, among the female electorate, they have already the majority in Germany. Yeah? It's the biggest party, if you like, in terms of votes. While with the male part of the society, it's completely different. Actually, the right-wing party is the strongest right now. So maybe the solution is just get rid of the males.
this is not a question but a comment, and it's regarding time. The science and technology actually have given us more time. I remember you all remember, it's not old, the older people might remember in the 60s, there was a prediction of mass starvation. The Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug and others forestalled that. There's new revolutions that go on all the time. We have finite resources, but for example, oil and gas, I think the ability to discover and extract economically oil and gas will keep us in oil and gas if we choose to use it for 100 years or more. What's the light at the end of the tunnel is that for whatever reasons, women's education, other things, late night television, human fertility goes down when there's rising wealth. And so when you have a peaking world population, whether it's 10, 11, 12 billion, then you can see something happening. The technology will keep food on rising prosperity in the world. The finite materials will last longer, hundreds, thousands of years. And so this is what we can, the rules have changed so dramatically in the last half century. And so we also have to remember that. And then if there is a peak population and the decline, then you see something that could be sustainable.
Yeah, a response to the political action question. One thing we need to do is be smarter about which kind of information we're providing society. So let me give one example. In the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which Americans look at as a housing crisis, but here in Europe turns out to have been $1 trillion or more of loss in the value of portfolios of pension firms, pension companies, and so forth. The $1 trillion loss came from mostly stranded assets. Stranded assets clearly in the fossil fuel business, people who own coal mines, but more surprisingly in the transmission network business, where increasingly people were finding they had invested huge amounts of money in transmission lines that were going from plants that no one wanted to run anymore to places that were already making huge progress they'd taken back control of their own utilities and were generating substantial quantities of locally generated renewables. And the financial markets didn't anticipate this. And what you saw was the book value, so the stock market value, of those assets, which were supposed to be the safest things you could possibly invest in, utilities and energy stocks, absolutely plummeted. Pension funds were furious that the auditors and so on, that is, information experts like us, had not given them any warning of this. And the response of Mark Carney, who's the head of the Bank of England and among other things, was to say, look, we already require all corporations to file in their annual reports information on what fraction of their assets are vulnerable to being nationalized, being taken over, or sit in war-torn areas, and you might just lose them from one year to the next. He said what we ought to do is be extending those to require disclosure of the climate-related financial risks of your capital assets, whether you're a company that has, like Boeing, all of your installed manufacturing and airline runway capacity already several feet below sea level, or a city like Rotterdam, or the transmission networks of Germany. He asked Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, to chair a task force made entirely of financial experts from the corporate world to figure out what such disclosures would actually look like. That was 2 years ago. The thing has come out. It's got half the Fortune 500 companies have now bought into it. And by conservative estimates, those reports are going to drive multiple $1 trillion of investments away from climate vulnerable, not just sea level rise and heat vulnerable, but vulnerable to policies and investment choices like the transmission networks. None of us knows how to direct multiple trillions of dollars as scientists. This isn't the business we're in, But there, simply by building up a set of information that the financial leaders agreed would be influential to their own decisions of where they would drive their own investments, Carney and his group managed to avoid all of the discount rate arguments. They avoided the issues of scientific community credibility because they're coming to us now to ask for what if our assets are vulnerable. But they didn't come to us to ask, what are the things we care about? So I think, first, there's going to be a whole growth industry and us being asked, well, what is vulnerable? How vulnerable is it? How soon is it? In what time spans it's vulnerable? But mostly, the influence here is because somebody thought hard about what leveraged very large amounts of money, which is what a lot of whether we get out of this trap or not is going to be about.
So I think at this point, I would like to thank the speakers for the excellent discussion.